Admiral Krasik's 8 spines stared at the holographic display with all 4 of his eyes twitching in perfect synchronization. His secondary heart had started palpitating the moment Lieutenant Paz'Nar brought this footage to his attention, and now his primary heart was joining in on the uncomfortable dance. In his 347 cycles as head of the Galactic Military Academy, he had never seen anything quite so disturbing. "Play it again," he commanded, his voice crackling with static from his speech synthesizer. The lieutenant, a nervous young Zentarian with shimmer scales that were currently flashing between purple and green, nodded and reset the recording. The footage began innocently enough, a standard surveillance capture of what the humans called an educational facility. The building itself seemed innocent enough, painted in garish colors that would never be approved by any self-respecting military institution. But it was what happened next that had sent ripples of concern through the entire intelligence division. Small humans, what their species referred to as children, emerged from transport vehicles and began their morning protocols. The recording zoomed in on their movements, and Admiral Krasik felt his dorsal spines ripple with unease. "Freeze frame," he barked, pointing at the screen with 2 of his upper appendages. "There. Do you see it, Lieutenant?" Lieutenant Paz'Nar's scales settled into a worried shade of deep blue. "Yes, Admiral. The small humans are executing perfect formation running patterns while pursuing what appears to be a primitive spherical weapon." Exactly. Krasik slammed his lower appendage on his hovering desk, causing several data pads to clatter to the floor. "And observe their tactical gear. Those backpacks are clearly designed for rapid deployment of supplies. The way they swing from those metal bars, obviously advanced zero-gravity training. And those sliding tubes, evacuation drills, clear as crystalline methane." The Admiral began pacing, his 8 spines flexing with agitation. The Security Council had assured everyone that humans were a relatively harmless species, only recently admitted to the Galactic Federation. But this changed everything. Sir Paz'Nar ventured carefully, scales shifting to a diplomatic shade of silver. "Perhaps we should consider the possibility that this is simply propaganda. The humans do have an unusual fondness for creating fictional entertainment." Krasik waved all 4 arms dismissively. "Propaganda? Look at the raw data markers. This footage was captured by our own autonomous observation drones." "No, Lieutenant, what we're seeing is real. The humans are training their young for combat, and they're doing it right under our sensory appendages." He turned to face the massive window overlooking the Academy's training grounds, where cadets from 50 different species were practicing standard military maneuvers. How primitive their methods seemed now, compared to whatever innovative combat system the humans had developed. "Get me everything we have on human educational facilities," he ordered, adjusting his ceremonial rank sash nervously. "And Lieutenant? Classify this information as level red. If the humans are training warriors from such an early development stage, we need to understand how and why. The security of the entire galaxy could depend on it." As Lieutenant Paz'Nar hurried away, scales now pulsing with urgent red patterns, Admiral Krasik turned back to the frozen image. There they were, tiny humans, laughing as they charged across what he now suspected was an incredibly sophisticated training ground disguised as something called a playground. "Clever humans," he muttered, all 4 eyes narrowing. "Very clever indeed." Professor Blip'Zap had a reputation throughout the Galactic Military Academy for being thorough, methodical, and slightly obsessed with categorizing everything into color-coded charts. The floating orb that served as their primary sensory cluster was currently cycling through shades of intense concentration as they assembled their research team in the Academy's strategic analysis chamber. "As you can see from my preliminary findings," Blip'Zap projected a series of 3-dimensional graphs into the air, their voice modulation set to presentation mode. "These human training facilities follow a consistent pattern across their planetary surface." The assembled team of researchers, representing 12 different species and 26 different appendage configurations, watched as red dots appeared across a holographic Earth. Each dot represented what the humans called a kindergarten, though Blip'Zap suspected this was a code name designed to sound harmless. "Commander Squish, your infiltration expertise will be essential." Blip'Zap gestured with one of their gravity manipulation fields toward a gelatinous mass that rippled, acknowledging. "Lieutenant Paz'Nar, your color-changing abilities make you ideal for surveillance. And Dr. Humph, your expertise in primitive warfare techniques will be invaluable." Dr. Humph, a particularly fluffy being from the gas giants of the Carina Nebula, puffed up importantly, releasing small clouds of analytical pheromones. But first, Blip'Zap continued, their orb turning a serious shade of mauve. We must establish contact with one of their training specialists. Admiral Krayzix has arranged an interview with a human designated as Nova Reynolds. The chamber doors whispered open, and in walked a human female wearing what the team immediately recognized as cleverly disguised battle armor, though the humans insisted on calling it a business suit. Her red hair was clearly styled for optimal aerodynamics, and her smile several team members nervously activated their personal shield generators. "Thank you for inviting me to your academy," Nova said, either unaware or diplomatically ignoring the way Commander Squish had partially liquefied from anxiety. "I understand you have some questions about early childhood education." Blip'Zap's orb flickered with excitement. "Yes, particularly about your combat preparation protocols. These training grounds you call playgrounds most ingenious camouflage. By the way, we've documented at least 15 different obstacle course configurations." Nova blinked. Obstacle course. Indeed, Dr. Humph contributed, releasing enthusiastic pheromones that made everyone's visual processors water. The elevated walking beam for balance training, the rotating platform for centrifugal force resistance, the swinging restraints for upper appendage strength development. "Do you mean the balance beam, merry-go-round, and swing set?" Nova asked slowly. "Ah, your species code names for them." "Yes," Blip'Zap bobbed excitedly. "But most impressive is your sand pit tactical training area. The way your young warriors practice fortification construction and siege warfare, brilliant." Lieutenant Paz'Nar's scales had shifted to match the exact shade of confusion on Nova's face. "Professor, perhaps." "And the recruitment chance," Blip'Zap continued, their orb now a brilliant yellow with academic fervor. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies," clearly a battle cry about biological warfare and mass casualties. Nova opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, then seemed to come to a decision. "Would your team perhaps like to observe a typical day at one of our training facilities?" Would we? Blip'Zap's gravity fields practically vibrated with anticipation. "We've already prepared our combat observation gear and emergency extraction protocols." "That won't be necessary," Nova said quickly, but the research team was already mobilizing. Commander Squish had formed themselves into what they believed was an inconspicuous humanoid shape, though they'd accidentally given themselves 3 legs, and Dr. Humph was practicing looking less fluffy and more intimidating. As they filed out of the chamber, Blip'Zap turned all their sensors toward Nova. "One question, Specialist Reynolds, why do you permit the young warriors to consume this substance called paste? Is it some form of survival ration testing?" Nova pinched the bridge of her nose and muttered something that sounded suspiciously like, "This is going to be an interesting day." Captain Yzzik, veteran of 3 galactic conflicts and decorated expert in stealth operations, was currently hiding behind a bush shaped like a cartoon dinosaur. His combat recording unit was working overtime as he documented what he was certain would go down in military history as the most terrifying display of organized chaos he'd ever witnessed. "Status report, 0900 hours, Earth time," he whispered into his neural transmitter. "The small warriors have begun their morning tactical exercises. Their energy levels are unprecedented, possibly enhanced by some form of chemical stimulant they call apple juice." Nearby, Commander Squish had disguised themselves as a particularly lumpy playground ball, though they kept accidentally bouncing whenever a child looked their way. Dr. Humph had wedged their fluffy mass into a tree, looking like a misplaced cotton candy cloud, while Lieutenant Paz'Nar's scales were rapidly cycling through every color of the rainbow in panic. "They're assembling for their morning war cry." Professor Blip'Zap's orb pulsed with excitement from their hiding spot inside a hollow plastic tube slide. Their voice crackled over the team's comm system as 25 kindergartners lined up for the morning pledge. Nova Reynolds stood at the back of the observation group, along with Ms. Butterworth, the increasingly amused kindergarten teacher, watching as the alien research team documented every single movement with hilarious seriousness. By the 7 moons of Xenox, Captain Yzzik's transmission suddenly burst across the comm channel. "The tiny warriors have initiated their combat training sequence. They're dividing into opposing forces." What Captain Yzzik was actually witnessing was the start of a perfectly normal game of tag, but to the veteran soldier's highly trained eye, it was clearly an elaborate military exercise in pursuit and evasion tactics. Look at their speed, their agility, The complete disregard for conventional battlefield formations, his voice rose several octaves. And their battle cries. Listen. You can't catch me, a pigtailed girl squealed as she ran past his bush, causing the captain to duck and activate his personal force field. Professor Blip'Zap's excited commentary continued. Observe how they've transformed the entire area into a multi-level combat arena. Some warriors have taken the high ground on the climbing frame, while others execute guerrilla tactics from beneath the slides. Commander Squish, still maintaining their bald disguise, had the misfortune of being discovered by a group of enthusiastic 4-year-olds. Tactical retreat compromised, they broadcast in panic as tiny hands began bouncing them around the playground, requesting immediate extraction. Negative, Commander Captain Yzzik responded, his professional composure cracking. My position is surrounded by warriors engaged in some form of ritual chanting circle. They appear to be summoning something called a Mr. Sun while performing synchronized movement protocols. Dr. Humph, trying to maintain their observation post in the tree, was creating a small shower of panic-shed fluff that the children below were now trying to catch, singing "It's snowing. It's snowing." Professor Nova tried to interject, "I really think we should." But her words were cut off by the sound that struck terror into the hearts of the alien observation team, the recess bell. Mass mobilization alert, Captain Yzzik screamed into the comm. All units brace for impact. What followed could only be described as controlled chaos from the aliens' perspective. Anyway, dozens of kindergartners streamed out of their classrooms, their high-pitched voices filling the air with what the research team was convinced were complex military coordinates. Lieutenant Paz'Nar, whose scales had settled on a disturbed shade of green, watched in horror as a small boy approached with a juice box. "Captain, they're deploying their tactical refreshment units. Should I engage in diplomatic negotiations?" Negative. Maintain cover, but it was too late. The boy had already offered the juice box to the color-changing alien, clearly impressed by the shifting patterns. Meanwhile, Professor Blip'Zap had emerged from the slide to get a better view, only to be immediately incorporated into a game of keep away by a group of children who thought the floating orb was a new type of playground ball. Fascinating, the professor broadcast while being gently tossed between giggling kids. They're training their targeting systems and practicing intercepting aerial targets. Most impressive, oh dear, please mind the sensory clusters. The situation reached its chaotic peak when a kindergartner with missing front teeth approached Captain Yzzik's bush and declared, "You're a funny-looking grown-up." The decorated captain, who had faced down space pirates and navigated asteroid fields, let out what he would later deny was a squeak and attempted to activate his emergency teleporter. Unfortunately, he had forgotten that Earth's atmosphere interfered with the device's functionality. Abort mission, he finally broadcast. All units fall back to extraction point Alpha. The sight of alien researchers trying to make a dignified retreat while being pursued by curious, laughing kindergartners would later become legendary at the Galactic Military Academy. Commander Squish never quite managed to reform their proper shape after being bounced so many times. Dr. Humph had lost enough fluff to stuff a small mattress. Lieutenant Paz'Nar's scales had settled into a traumatized shade of puce that wouldn't fade for days. As they regrouped at a safe distance, Nova Reynolds and Ms. Butterworth finally allowed themselves to laugh. The aliens, maintaining what dignity they could, tried to straighten their various appendages and composure. "I believe," Professor Blip'Zap announced, their orbs spinning with excitement despite being slightly dented, "we may need to seriously revise our understanding of human military capabilities. Never in all my research have I witnessed such organized chaos." Captain Yzzik, still picking leaves from his ceremonial uniform, could only nod in shell-shocked agreement. The Galactic Security Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 37 spacefaring civilizations gathered for an emergency session. Admiral Krayzik's 8 spines stood at the central podium, all 4 arms gripping the edges while his spines twitched with barely contained agitation. Distinguished members of the council, his voice synthesizer crackled with urgency. "What I am about to present will fundamentally change our understanding of human military capability. Professor Blip'Zap, if you would begin the briefing." The professor's orb, still sporting a small dent from the playground incident, hovered to the center of the chamber. The holographic displays activated, showing footage from their field research. As you can see, Blip'Zap began, their voice modulation set to maximum academic seriousness. human military training begins at an incredibly early development stage. Their young are organized into units they call grades, starting with something they designate as kindergarten. Gasps echoed through the chamber as the footage played. Captain Yzyck's shaky combat recordings showed children racing across the playground, their laughter now interpreted as war cries by the horrified audience. Supreme Chancellor Paz'Nar, a being composed entirely of crystalline thought structures, chimed in harmonic distress. Are you suggesting that humans begin combat training while still in their larval stage? Precisely. Admiral Krasix activated another holographic display. Observe their training facilities, each one equipped with specialized apparatus designed to build strength, agility, and tactical thinking. They call it physical education. The council erupted into concerned murmuring. Representative Zongfar, whose species communicated through interpretive dance, performed a particularly anxious pirouette. But wait, there's more. Professor Blip'Zap's orb spun with academic fervor. Commander Squish, please share your infiltration findings. Commander Squish, still slightly misshapen from their playground experience, oozed forward. During my time disguised as recreational equipment, I documented numerous combat exercises disguised as games. They call one duck, Goose, clearly a training protocol for evasive maneuvers and pursuit tactics. Lieutenant Paz'Nar's scales shifted to emergency red as they added, and their refueling rituals. They gather in formation twice daily for something called snack time. The young warriors are given concentrated energy packets, cookies, and tactical hydration units marketed as juice boxes. The chamber descended into chaos. Representative Blip'Zap, a normally composed gas-based entity, became so agitated they nearly condensed into a liquid. Order. Admiral Krasix banged all four arms on the podium. We haven't even gotten to their psychological conditioning programs yet. Dr. Humph, still missing patches of fluff, floated forward. They use something called nursery rhymes, complex psychological programming disguised as simple songs. Take this one, the ants go marching. Clear military drilling instructions. And this little piggy? Obviously a lesson in resource management and rationing. The Supreme Chancellor's crystalline structure vibrated with concern. What about their combat training results? Surely we have performance metrics. Professor Blip'Zap eagerly projected new data streams. Their training methods are devastatingly effective. By age 5, human warriors can run at full speed while screaming for sustained periods, scale vertical surfaces with minimal equipment, organize complex tactical operations they call tag and hide and seek, demonstrate remarkable resistance to biological warfare agents they call cooties, master psychological warfare through an advanced technique known as but why. And their endurance, Captain Yzzik added, still visibly traumatized. We observed them maintaining peak energy levels even after hours of continuous operation. Their power source remains a mystery, though we suspect it's connected to something they call nap time. A new wave of panic swept through the chamber. Representative Zongfar's distressed dance became so elaborate they had to be given extra space. There's something else. Admiral Krasix's voice dropped to a grim whisper. We've discovered that these training facilities are everywhere. They call it universal education. The implications are staggering. They're training their entire population for combat from earliest development. The council chamber erupted into overlapping crisis protocols. The methane-breathing delegates began stress fermenting. The silicon-based representatives started to crystallize from anxiety. 3 different species simultaneously initiated their species' version of fainting. We must act. Supreme Chancellor Paz'Nar chimed in alarm. Perhaps sanctions? Trade restrictions? Mandatory review of their educational system. Wait, a new voice cut through the chaos. Nova Reynolds stood at the chamber entrance, accompanied by Ms. Butterworth, and to the horror of the assembled aliens, 3 kindergartners who had insisted on coming along to see the space station. The sight of actual human children caused several more representatives to initiate emergency protection protocols. Commander Squish tried to disguise themselves as ceremonial floor decoration. Before you make any decisions, Nova announced, trying not to laugh at the panic her young companions were causing, I believe we should schedule a proper cultural exchange. In fact, these children would love to teach you all a traditional Earth game. Duck. Goose, the kindergartners announced cheerfully. The resulting chaos as dignified galactic representatives fled from giggling human children would go down in council history as the Great Panic of Station 7. Admiral Krasix's spines would never quite recover their proper alignment from the shock. And somewhere in the background, Professor Blip'Zap could be heard excitedly documenting everything, their orb glowing with academic delight. Fascinating. They've managed to infiltrate the highest levels of galactic government with their tiny warriors. Simply brilliant. After the Great Panic subsided and the various council representatives were coaxed out of their emergency shelters, Nova Reynolds stood before the Galactic Security Council with an amused smile. Behind her, Ms. Butterworth's kindergartners were happily coloring with special space crayons, completely oblivious to the nervous twitches they were causing among the assembled dignitaries. Honorable council members, Nova began, trying to keep a straight face. I believe there's been a slight misunderstanding about human educational practices. Today, I'd like to explain what kindergarten actually is. She gestured to the children. These are not warriors in training. They're simply children learning through play. Everything you've observed, the running, climbing, singing, and games, these are natural behaviors that help young humans develop physically, socially, and emotionally. Admiral Krasix's spines drooped in confusion. But the tactical exercises? The combat training. You mean tag? Nova clicked to her first presentation slide, showing children playing. This game helps develop motor skills, spatial awareness, and social bonds. It's not military training, it's just fun. Fun? Professor Blip'Zap's orb dimmed in puzzlement. You mean purposeless activity for enjoyment? Not purposeless at all, Ms. Butterworth stepped forward. Through play, children learn crucial life skills. Watch this. She turned to the children. Who wants to show our alien friends how to build with blocks? The enthusiastic response caused several council members to activate their shield generators, but they watched in fascination as the children began constructing an elaborate structure. Notice how they're learning geometry, physics, and cooperation, Nova explained. When that tower falls, and they'll learn about cause and effect, problem solving, and resilience. Right on cue, the block tower collapsed. Instead of the military response the aliens expected, they witnessed something extraordinary. The children laughed and started rebuilding. Commander Squish, who had finally regained their proper shape, oozed closer in fascination. But what about the war chants? The ring around the rosy protocol. Those are nursery rhymes and singing games, Nova explained, as the children demonstrated ring around the rosy. They teach rhythm, language skills, and cultural traditions. Yes, some have historical origins, but today they're simply part of childhood fun. Lieutenant Paz'Nar's scales shifted to a confused purple. And the obstacle courses. Playground equipment, Ms. Butterworth corrected gently. Slides teach cause and effect. Swings develop balance and spatial awareness. Jungle gyms build strength and confidence. Every piece of equipment serves a developmental purpose, just not the military one you imagined. One of the children approached Supreme Chancellor Paz'Nar, holding up a crayon drawing. The crystalline being's structure trembled slightly before accepting the artwork with surprising gentleness. You see, Nova continued, early childhood education isn't about creating warriors. It's about nurturing growing minds and bodies. The energy you witnessed, that's just how children are. The chaos that seemed so tactical, that's just the beautiful mess of learning and growing. Professor Blip'Zap's orb brightened with sudden understanding. So when they were bouncing me around the playground, they thought you were a fun new toy, Ms. Butterworth confirmed. Children learn through exploration and play. Sometimes that means turning a distinguished alien professor into a ball. The chamber filled with what might have been laughter, though several species expressed it through color changes, harmonic vibrations, or interpretive dance. Admiral Krasix slumped in his hover chair, all four arms drooping. You mean we've been documenting normal childhood behavior, not an elaborate military training program? Exactly, Nova smiled. Though I must say your research team's interpretations were quite creative. Captain Yzzik, who had been maintaining a safe distance from the children, watched in amazement as one of them fell asleep during story time. But what about their extraordinary endurance? The energy levels. Watch this, Ms. Butterworth said, checking her watch. In about 10 minutes, they'll all need a snack and a nap. True to her word, the energy levels in the room gradually decreased until the mighty warriors that had terrified the Galactic Security Council were sleepily munching on cookies and asking for their favorite stuffed animals. Dr. Humph, who had been quietly collecting shed fluff from the floor, puffed thoughtfully. So all this time, we were just observing. Childhood. A perfectly normal part of human development, Nova confirmed. Though I must say, your report about our kindergartens will make a wonderful addition to our own historical archives. Perhaps we could arrange some cultural exchange programs. Help your species understand human childhood development better. The council members, watching the now drowsy children, found themselves experiencing unfamiliar sensations. Some would later describe it as endearment, others as embarrassment, and a few simply produced confused electromagnetic pulses. Supreme Chancellor Paz'Nar, still holding the crayon drawing, chimed softly, "I believe we may have something to learn from human educational methods after all. 2 standard galactic months later." Admiral Krasik's 8 spines stood before the Galactic Command Review Board, all 4 arms clasped behind his back, his spines wilted in what could only be described as extreme embarrassment. The vast chamber was filled with the most senior military leaders from across the galaxy, and every single one of them was trying desperately not to laugh. So General Zuz wheezed, their gas-based form rippling with barely contained amusement. "You mean to tell us that your entire emergency report about human military superiority was based on playground activities?" "In my defense," Krasik muttered, his speech synthesizer barely above a whisper. Their organizational skills were very convincing. The recording of his research team's playground observations played on the massive screen behind him. The part where Commander Squish bounced across the playground, surrounded by laughing children, had already become the most shared video in Galactic Military Academy history. And the part about their advanced tactical training programs, Admiral Zip-Zap inquired, their tentacles twitching with mirth. "Duck, duck." Goose was very complicated at first glance, Krasik defended weakly. But something unexpected happened as the board reviewed the complete findings. General Vortex, known throughout the galaxy as the grumpiest war veteran in 7 sectors, leaned forward with genuine interest. "Actually," they rumbled, "there might be something to this human educational approach. Look at the results: problem-solving, creativity, adaptability, team building." That was how, 3 weeks later, the Galactic Military Academy found itself implementing what they called the Human Childhood Development Initiative. The results were interesting. Professor Blip'Zap's orb spun with excitement as they supervised the first playground installation at the Academy. No, Commander Squish, you're supposed to slide down the slide, not ooze up it." The Academy's training grounds had been transformed. Jungle gyms designed for multiple species dotted the landscape. A massive swing set accommodated everything from tentacles to anti-gravity fields. The sandbox was particularly popular, though they had to replace the sand with non-digestible particles after several incidents with the silicon-based cadets. Lieutenant Paz'Nar, now the head of what they called recess supervision, watched their scales shift through happy colors as veteran military officers discovered the joy of tetherball. Though they did have to ban the plasma-based beings from playing after several balls were accidentally vaporized. "The results are remarkable," Nova Reynolds noted during her consultation visit. She watched as a group of senior military strategists engaged in an enthusiastic game of hopscotch. "Their problem-solving capabilities have improved by 200%. Not to mention unit cohesion," Captain Yzzik added, now fully recovered from his playground trauma and currently teaching a group of cadets how to play red light, green light. Though they had to modify the rules slightly for the species that could see in 11 dimensions. The Naptime initiative had been particularly revolutionary. Dr. Humph had designed special fluffy rest areas, and productivity across all departments had skyrocketed after they implemented mandatory quiet time. Even the most hardened warriors had to admit there was something to be said for milk and cookies followed by a short nap. The biggest surprise came during the first annual Galactic Military Academy Field Day. Teams from every species competed in events, like the 3-legged race modified for various numbers of appendages, the egg and spoon race, using stable antimatter containment spheres instead of eggs, and the crowd-favorite musical chairs in zero gravity. Admiral Krasik, watching from his observation post, felt his spine straighten with pride. Sure, he'd made a massive mistake in his initial assessment of human education. Yes, the video of him fleeing from a group of kindergartners playing tag would probably follow him for the rest of his career. And true, Commander Squish still occasionally reverted to ball shape whenever they heard children laughing. But as he watched a serious diplomatic dispute between the methane breathers and the silicon-based life forms get resolved through a friendly game of duck, duck, goose. He couldn't help but think they'd stumbled onto something important. Fascinating, isn't it? Professor Blip'Zap hovered next to him, their orb glowing contentedly. Who would have thought that the most effective military training program in galactic history would involve finger painting and story time? The final report to Galactic Command included some unexpected statistics. 300% increase in creative problem solving. 500% improvement in team cooperation. 1000% decrease in interspecies conflicts. Infinite % increase in finger painting skills. Though they did have to include a few incident reports. 3 cases of silicon-based cadets attempting to eat the art supplies. 1 diplomatic incident involving a heated debate over proper hopscotch technique. Several instances of gas-based beings getting too excited during tag and accidentally achieving fusion. As Admiral Krasix finished his final review of the Human Childhood Development Initiative, he received one last transmission from Earth. It was a crayon drawing from Ms. Butterworth's class, showing what appeared to be a many-armed stick figure playing on a swing set. The message read, "To our favorite alien friends, thank you for learning how to play." He hung it in his office, right next to his numerous military accommodations. After all, he thought, watching a group of senior officers enthusiastically setting up for block tower building practice, sometimes the best tactical advantages come in the most unexpected packages. And if anyone noticed that he'd started keeping a supply of cookies in his desk for particularly stressful days, well, that was just good strategic planning.